I'm Gail Robinson, president of the Ash Creek Conservation Association, and I want to introduce Brian Quinn. He's the founder and principal of One Nature, an ecological consulting firm with a distinctive approach to protecting and preserving nature using organic methods based on a deep respect for nature. He's also the co-founder of One Nature Engineering. Back in 2012, Brian wrote our first master plan. It was 87 pages long, and we've used that plan for the past decade as a guide to determine the priority of our projects and which projects we should focus on. It's also been used by Fuss & O'Neill, which is a big consulting firm, to help create the Rooster River Watershed Plan in 2014. This year, we commissioned Brian's firm, One Nature, to update the plan with specific emphasis on the effects of climate change and sea level rise. The plan will likely be 100 pages or more this year. So he's here to present that plan. So please join me in welcoming Brian.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you all for attending tonight. As Gail said, I'm Brian Quinn, and it's a pleasure to be working here on this project again. I feel like we've been doing a lot of, well, I know we've been doing a lot of work for over a decade, and I feel like I maybe have forgotten as much as I know at this point about the estuary. There's so much information, learning new things every day. But we had a warm up to this presentation last week with the in-person presentation, which hopefully this round two is even better than that. So here we go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you all, and then if you're all familiar with Zoom, probably you're welcome to use the chat button at the bottom to ping questions along the way, or interrupt me if you'd like. And then we reserve some time at the end of this to do a question and answer session as well. So here goes. And the presentation will be it is recorded, so and that recording will be made available within a few days or weeks for anyone who needs it. So I trust you can all see this title slide at this point. This is Ash Creek Estuary Master Plan on the front.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so this is slide one of our presentation. So we all know that Ash Creek is a critical and unique place. I think we do. Everybody on this call is most likely very familiar with the estuary. We know that it has high quality habitat. We know that it's important culturally, educationally, recreationally. We know it hosts threatened and endangered plants and animals. We know it protects green infrastructure. And we know, well, some of us know that it's actually relatively low cost to restore as far as the cost of estuary restoration goes. It's a very compact estuary with defined borders. Many estuaries are very open with multiple braided channels and things. You have a singular outlet here at the Barrier Spit or St. Mary's by the Sea Beach. And it's a very understandable estuary for the most part. So in terms of planning for the future, if there's one spot to spend resources, it sure is Ash Creek. You just get a lot of bang for your buck here. Unfortunately, it's also an endangered place. And what does that mean by endangered? I'll go into this in detail. Essentially, the estuary is on the edge of ecological collapse. Even in conservative sea level rise estimates, that we're projecting there's going to be no wetlands at all left in the West Estuary by 2100 without additional action. If erosion patterns don't change at the Barrier Spit at the beach, based on the current rate of erosion, we see the potentially completely below high tide by 2036, which is not that far away. We see development pressures on the estuary are increasing. We have a housing crisis throughout the country, and there's endless pressures to develop in the estuary. And the estuary is split between two municipalities, meaning Fairfield and Bridgeport. So you combine those things together and you have a very threatened space. We've broken that out into 6 categories for the purposes of this master plan. And we're trying to highlight the problem for each of these and then also propose solutions that could mitigate against these problems. Briefly, these are wetland loss, shoreline erosion, habitat fragmentation, further development, governmental coordination, and just general complexity. So what I'll do here in this presentation, the first half of my presentation, I'll go through these 6 topics. And then in the second half, I will go more specifically into particular neighborhoods, giving examples of how those neighborhoods will be affected throughout the estuary. So first, we have this problem of wetland loss, right? On the left side of your screen, you can see this is a map from Connecticut Deep of wetlands in 1890. In the middle is wetlands in 1990. The black areas are the wetlands. And on the right, you see no wetlands projected in 2100. Essentially, we've lost more than half of our wetlands just since 1890, and probably between 1890 and the time of early contact, European colonial contact, you probably lost at least half before 1890 as well. So slow decline of the system. And what we're seeing here is really the bitter end of what's happening. Now, why is this happening? There's really 2 reasons. One is people. These intertidal wetlands, they like to migrate inland as the sea levels rise and fall. But there's simply no place. There's certainly been periods in Earth's climate when the seas have risen and fallen before, but the wetlands have always had a place to migrate to during those times. Now, with rising tides, the wetlands are stuck between their current status and a hardened shoreline and private property. So really, they're kind of trapped. So that's one problem. There's no opportunity for what we call marsh migration. The other problem is rising sea levels. Intertidal wetlands live in a very narrow range of the tidal column, right below mean high tide. And as the high tide rises, it becomes less suitable for these plants to survive. Now, wetlands do have something called accretion, where they do naturally add elevation most of the time. But at the rate of even conservative levels of sea level change are predicted, they simply cannot biologically lift themselves fast enough in this area to keep up with the change. So those are big problems. Now, what are some solutions to those problems? In our study, we talk about, one is this thing called living shorelines. Living shorelines are a way to plant the edges of the estuary and protect the edges of existing spartina or wetland areas with all sorts of things. That it can be protected by oyster reefs or seawalls or whatnot. But the idea is you break up the wave action and then you try to increase the elevation of the wetlands there. Another option, particularly in the Great Marsh Island and some of the larger sections of wetland, is something called wetland accretion or thin layer deposition. It's another term for it. This is when you essentially pump a few inches of material on the wetland every so often. Varies based on sites and studies which have not been done yet, but every so often you add thin layers of deposition, which the plants grow through, and you help them accrete faster. You help those wetlands rise more quickly. Another option we're looking at is, and it's already begun, is barrier spit reinforcement. Barrier spit is the geological term for St. Mary's Beach. It's down here on the bottom. Can you all see my cursor, the little white hand around the square?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Rich. So this barrier spit, what happens is it's a hardened, like rocky kind of headland that tends to collect sand on one edge, and that's the definition of a barrier spit. You all know this is St. Mary's by the Sea. Another approach to protecting wetlands would be to raise the elevation of the barrier spit and reinforce it. Now, this reinforcement has already started, most recently with planting a lot of beach grass this past summer quite successfully. And what that does is stabilize the landform. Adding more sand to the top of that will help it keep up with sea level change. It's so important for wetlands, even though barrier spit itself is not really a wetland. It's important for the Great Marsh Island because it breaks, Great Marsh Island being the large intertidal wetland in the center of the lower estuary. It breaks up wave action and it protects it from erosion that way. And the last solution we're highlighting in our report we're suggesting land use changes. Here you can see this at the same scale, approximately a brightly colored red, orange, and yellow map overlay on top of our aerial photo. The red is a conservative level of estimate of where the high tide will be by 2100. The orange is a intermediate estimate of sea level rise by 2100, and yellow is a more extreme scenario or a more serious scenario. Some areas, like especially this one that we've highlighted here, are very threatened by sea level rise, and we should consider serious land use changes there in the future.
I'm not seeing any slides. I'm just seeing birds against a sunset. Is anybody else seeing the slides?
Yeah, I'm seeing the slides.
You are, okay.
That's interesting.
All right.
Gail, maybe I'll stop the share and start it again.
Oh, yeah, just get me out of the share. That'll
Maybe
probably
it's
do
because
it
you're I added you as a
co-host.
possibly. Let me see here.
Sorry about that.
Okay. Is anyone else not seeing the slides?
Well, not right now.
Right. All right, let's try again here.
So sorry. Oh, good. Yeah,
Does this work for everyone? Okay.
thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thanks for letting me know. Okay. So next issue we've been looking at is shoreline erosion. Now, shoreline erosion in the estuary adds to wetland loss, but also threatens upland areas and decreases habitat, opens up space for invasive species to come in and colonize the shorelines, reducing habitat value. On the left here, this is the very familiar St. Mary's by the Sea barrier spit. And as we highlighted earlier, this is rapidly eroding. Perhaps that erosion has decreased slightly due to the new plantings, but time will tell. It's tough to measure in just a few months. You need to look at it over a series of years to really prove that out. In the middle, we have a picture from Gilman of a tree. So you might be familiar with this. Certain areas, you have undercutting of the bank from wave action, increased wave action. And as sea level rises, this will become more serious and more pronounced. The bank gets carved out from the base, and then trees fall in, plants fall in, and you have kind of an undermining. Eventually, this comes back and reaches the streets in the community and other important types of infrastructure that are out there. Then we have erosion of the wetlands themselves. On the right-hand side here, we have a photo from on the bottom from the 1930s. This is the Great Marsh Island, the southwest tip of it. And you can see, this is all Spartina wetland in here. You can tell from the texture of the picture. And then up into this area as well. Fast forward to about 5 years ago, and you can see there's very little Spartina in that area. Every wetland in the system, we could hone in and look at this and see this type of erosion that's happening. But it's quite significant to have lost this much wetland in under 100 years. So one great explanation for some of this erosion that's been happening, especially near the barrier spit, was the development of the South Benson Marina. Again, we have the 1930s on the left here, and we have early 1950s in the middle, and I believe 1960s on the right. You see on the left, excuse me, on the left, South Benson Marina, as it is today, would have been over this large Spartina wetland complex. This is Turney Creek as it comes in. This is Riverside Creek as it comes in behind Jennings Beach. And then you look at the shape of the landform of the barrier spit. It's a very gentle kind of point. And then you have Jennings Beach. When we were interviewing people 10 years ago in the area about what this used to look like, it was a much more shallow tidal inlet in this area. At low tide, you could walk across from one side to the other. In very low tide, sometimes it would be almost completely exposed. It's a very gentle kind of system here at the outlet of the estuary. But then, as part of the South Benson Marina construction, this new jetty was installed, which you can see in the middle picture, this long linear shape. That's a riprap wall, essentially. And what that did is it disturbed the sand system in the area. In Long Island Sound, you have, well, in all oceans, you have something called littoral drift, which is the movement of sand through a system. And in this case, in Long Island Sound, the sand doesn't move upshore or downshore as much as it's determined by major storm events and hurricanes. So it can move all over the place locally. That system, which had some kind of balance previously, was disrupted by the installation of this jetty. And you can see the kind of formation of these weird sandbars as it was trying to figure itself out through the tides. Pretty serious disturbance. And then on the right, you see once the marina has been dug and a navigable channel was dug out. This shape here you can see is not a natural landform, right? This is a very linear shape dug in order to allow deep water vessels into the marina. And you see kind of the completion of this whole change to the system. Pretty significant change. What ended up happening is that in order to dredge this material, or when this material would be dredged, it would be most often placed on Jennings Beach, creating a nice sandy beach over here, but at the cost of sand material of the barrier spit, exacerbating the erosion problem. In fact, a few years ago, we were hired by ACCA to do a erosion study at the barrier spit, and we documented 60 feet of beach retreat between 2006 and 2016, which is only a 10-year period. You divide that out over 10 years, that's about 6 feet per year. And that's very serious. And that's how we come up with the number of 2036 of when the barrier spit would be below high tide completely because of that rate of decline. Okay, what are some solutions to shoreline erosion? Well, one is plant stabilization, adding things like beach grass and other dune species to the barrier spit do stabilize the system. And even if they're covered by sand by future activities or hurricanes, they tend to sprout through the sand. Very good. Also, more inland in the estuary, this dune grass or other types of species, such as Spartina or types of saltwater tolerant native shrubs and trees, they help to stabilize the shoreline. So one big solution is just maintaining a healthy plant habitat along the whole edge of the estuary. Another option, which I alluded to earlier, is sand replenishment. Simply moving sand from the ocean or the sound back inland to raise up the level of that barrier spit. Dredging coordination to ensure that any type of dredging associated with South Benson Marina or otherwise is done with the estuary's health in mind. Dock removal and moratorium on new docks would also be a great. This is not a picture from the estuary. But this would be a fabulous thing to pursue. Motorboats especially are very damaging to intertidal estuaries, especially ones that are suffering as much as this one. The wake of the boat causes exacerbated erosion. People at different tides kind of plow through mudflat and wetland and disturb the bottom. Just generally something, stick to a non-mechanized watercraft is the best approach when you're trying to save an estuary. Last but not least, invasive species management, which is a complicated topic. Specifically the use of herbicide has traditionally been the primary way that invasive species has been controlled. In our management plan, we suggest eliminating all herbicide use throughout the estuary and having a more laissez-faire approach with most of these species. But at the same time, targeting specific areas and specific species more in a more focused manner, in a more effective way, without the use of chemicals. On the left here is a picture of the newly planted barrier spit, and this is a great example of exactly what we want to be doing. In the middle is a illustration my firm made about 12 years ago of how we would like to see the barrier spit, and what was formerly Kaposi Park and is now the sanctuary at St. Mary's figured out as part of our last round of master planning. And this is well on its way, I'm happy to say. This effort, we have, you can see the barrier spit has been planted. It has not been raised as much as we would have liked, but that's a bigger project. And the work that's been done at the refuge at St. Mary's with the elimination of a lot of ailanthus and other highly invasive trees, and the planting of dozens and dozens, maybe more than dozens, right, Rick, of native trees is a really big habitat improvement that we'll see the benefit of in the years to come. Now, another issue is habitat fragmentation. Habitat fragmentation, the estuary does not end at the high tide line, right? It goes upland of that, and it includes all the drainage basin, all the runoff area that goes to the estuary itself. This is a picture of in the upper section of the estuary where street ends come right down to the water, and there's essentially no room for any type of naturalized area, any type of strong habitat, except for possibly mudflat. What we've seen, if you were to come here 500 years ago, you would have seen a thick forest here with maybe a little meadow that was managed by people. And what we've done, across the whole, eastern seaboard is fragment that original ecological system into high density and medium density residential housing. And it's come at a cost. Now even the monarch butterfly is on the endangered species list, I believe, and a huge number of other pollinator and bird species that are really important to the health of our ecosystems. And the estuary especially. There's a dynamic relationship between upland and tidal areas where, for example, you'll have animals go eat shellfish that live in the forest, and you'll have animals in the estuary benefit from upland processes of nutrient transfer downstream. So what are some solutions to habitat fragmentation? One is use of native plants in the landscape wherever possible. It takes a little bit of a paradigm shift for a lot of people to imagine something besides lawn in their front yards, but habitats like we see here on the left that this homeowner created are tremendously more beneficial, like quantifiably more beneficial for things like pollinators and songbirds than just a simple lawn. A simple lawn has almost no ecological value. It's still more valuable than concrete or pavement, but it provides very little habitat. Stormwater management. In the center here, you can see 3 shades of blue. Each shade of blue represents a different basin within the estuary, drainage basin, meaning if you're a raindrop and you fall anywhere in these shaded areas, you will end up in Ash Creek. If you fall outside of the shaded areas, like over here, for example, you would end up in Black Rock Harbor. But the way the topography works and the elevations work, if you're falling here, you end up in the estuary. This is really critical because every time it rains, you have all sorts of pollutants go straight into the estuary. One great example of this is lawn fertilizer. People who fertilize their lawns, if it rains, immediate nutrient charge to the estuary, which can be very damaging. Another example are things like dog droppings in a neighborhood, or pollutants, road pollutants, salts, all these things. They all travel downstream and they end up in the estuary. We've done a better job of controlling the combined sewer overflows, where we have our sewage accidentally reaching the estuary. But we still have a lot of work to do with our rainwater and our stormwater drainage basins to clean that up and move it more slowly and in a more filtered way to this resource. Last but not least, we're suggesting more urban forestry. That's quite simply more street trees. The more street trees a block has, the more ecological integrity that habitat that they create. They also have other benefits of cooling neighborhoods and creating a more scenic or aesthetically pleasing environment. But primarily these things, street trees, they slow rainwater down. They provide a lot of beneficial habitat. They open up the ground. They have carbon fixation, all sorts of benefits to the estuary. So that's kind of the third prong of addressing habitat fragmentation. Here's a couple renderings that I did this past summer showing just the potential of what a residential property could look like in an urban area. This is a maximal scenario. Very few people would actually strive for something like this, but it is also like an a la carte menu of what homeowners can use to have a more sustainable relationship with their habitat. Things like creating native meadows, canopy trees, fruit rooms. If there's any beekeepers out there, that's a great thing to do to increase pollination. All sorts of really, really fun things. Play areas, pretty much a rethinking of the modern day urban and suburban landscape. We're suggesting that people consider. Again, not all of this everywhere, but in some of these things in some places where appropriate. Stream daylighting comes up later on in this presentation around Turney Creek, but as long as we're thinking about drainage basins in the estuary, all those original streams that flowed through our neighborhoods, they still exist. They've just been buried in pipes. And when there's an approach where you can actually open up the ground above those buried pipes and have a daylit stream again. That's called stream daylighting. On the left here is a well-known daylighting project in Yonkers of the Sawmill River. If you look on the left-hand picture, there's a kind of a circular oculus in the front of this building. And then in the picture on the right, there's that same building, just to locate you. And essentially what the project engineers did here was remove a parking lot or whatever, a paved area, to create a stream. It's a intensive endeavor, but in some cases really nice. It adds a lot of ecological value to have daylit streams because they can have more sunlight and oxygen and actually a living community capable of cleaning stormwater and providing increased habitat, in some cases even places for Spartina marsh to migrate towards. This is particularly relevant for Turney Creek, which many people don't even know where Turney Creek is, but it comes out of the lower section of the estuary and flows through Fairfield, through really some Spartina and a lot of Phragmites marshland up until If you know the Circle Diner as a landmark, that's right here, or the McDonald's is over here. And the creek actually flows under the roads here and then reemerges on the other side here. So if you could imagine through this clover leaf, somehow if there was a creek daylighting, that would be one example, a very large scale example of stream daylighting. There's other more small scale examples of smaller pipes that could be revealed and exposed once again. I should mention that Ash Creek is part of the Rooster River watershed. Ash Creek is the terminus of the Rooster River watershed. A lot of these principles, especially stream daylighting and habitat fragmentation, transcend just Ash Creek and are relevant to the entire Rooster River watershed. Further development is something we need to watch out for. In the master plan, we talk extensively about the types of development threats that the resource faces and may face in the future. Some of them, we can learn from the past that, on the top left here, this is from the local library. Someone was proposing to do this to Great Marsh Island, full development, and this to St. Mary's, like a second jetty, and basically dredge this all out and have a bridge where there used to be a mill dam here, actually. Obviously a bad idea. It was fought off. It wasn't allowed, but this type of thing could still happen again in the future. We think we're through this period of time sometimes that this kind of threat happening to our natural resources, but you've got to remain attentive to proposals to make sure they don't. More recently, ideas of expanded, recreational motorboating in the estuary, that's an issue that doesn't seem to be going away and needs to be continually addressed. More housing developments in the estuary. These need to be looked at closely. When you bring in any type of new construction, what is the timeline you're looking at in terms of sea level change, and will it be above water in 100 years, and what's the long-term impact? And last but not least here, even, just a few months ago, there was a proposal to, put these like very hardened docks and decks off the Fairfield side of the estuary and right into Ash Creek, which was since shot down. But even people with the best intentions here, Marsh Boardwalk and Educational Boardwalk and stuff, like even with the best of intentions, there's some proposals that would be on net we would not consider positive for the ecology of the estuary. So what are some solutions? One solution is education and outreach. Basically, the higher the community ecological IQ, so to speak, the better decision making will be made about these development projects. Another is land use improvements. We chose this picture to show that it's nice to walk right through the middle of the barrier spit, but in some cases it's maybe shouldn't be allowed. And this is perhaps like a lesson that could be learned for other places with habitat restoration, where certain areas need to be given back to nature, so to speak. This is right after that beautiful beach grass planting was done. If you walk on a new beach grass planting or even an existing one, your feet can disturb the root zone and compromise the planting. So interesting lesson to be learned there. And last but not least, estuary beneficial development. We use estuary beneficial development, meaning something different than just green development, something truly beneficial to this estuary. There's a big problem these days in the architecture and engineering world, where all sorts of projects will be proposed and the developer will put on like a green roof on the building, for example, and call it ecologically sustainable. Well, we suggest a higher bar than that, a greater metric, where actually every project proposed, any type of land use change or new project, has to prove how it actually has net benefit to the estuary. How does it actually improve the estuary? Not how does it do some general smoke and mirrors to make it appear sustainable. What does it actually do for the estuary? In this case, a very dense native planting, for example, but more. We can go into that in detail later if you'd like. Intergovernmental coordination is a big problem. On the left here, you can see the boundary between, the boundary between, oh, going the wrong direction. Okay, the boundary between Fairfield and Bridgeport. And it goes right through the center of the estuary, right through Great Marsh Island. It even encloses part of the barrier spit. And, you know, on the right is a picture of Great Marsh Island. And as you look at this, you know, the boundary is somewhere in the middle of this, but you can't see any boundary, right? Like it only exists on a map. Ecological systems do not care about political boundaries. They're best managed holistically. And that's what we're trying to encourage here. But unfortunately, having multiple municipalities and jurisdictions in a single estuary presents a lot of problems. There can be redundancy, there can be disagreement in management. So that is a real threat. So what do we do about it? One is increase state and federal involvement. By that, we do not mean you know, federal or state entities coming in a controlling sense, but more making their resources available, financial resources, and also their expert scientists. The Army Corps of Engineers, for example, has a whole group of experts in coastal ecology, sand movement, engineering. Those resources should be made available to this estuary. We suggest the creation of a joint estuary management authority, which has some real teeth to it, something that can actually make recommendations on updates to local ordinances and laws to prevent certain types of development in the estuary and encourage other types. Also something that can actively monitor in the long term the health of the estuary and prioritize projects without considering political borders, something that just considers purely ecological health and the benefit of to the community. More coordinated project development in that vein, thinking about perhaps a gross combination of budgets between all jurisdictions for the estuary rather than seeing discrete projects that are unrelated to each other. Expansion of not-for-profit and higher education partnerships is really critical as well. For example, ACCA has been developing a great relationship with Save the Sound, who has helped with some recent grant proposals that we hope go through. Those types of collaborations with the not-for-profit sector and higher education partnerships with people writing dissertations and PhDs on intertidal issues. They should know about Ash Creek, and we should definitely embrace that kind of research to draw attention, resources, and funds and knowledge about the estuary. One of the ways you do this, and you incorporate many different people and outside expertise, is through something called collaborative adaptive management. Traditionally, projects would be not cyclical as this diagram shows, but more linear, where someone would fund it, it would be studied, it would be designed, it would be built, and then on to the next project. With ecological systems, what you want to do is actually fund it, build something more modest or medium scale, study how it works, and then do it again with improvements, and learn from your mistakes and learn from your successes, really taking technical expertise to heart. We shouldn't view the estuary as whatever solutions are in this master plan, for example, should not be the end-all be-all solutions. They just are the current proposals. And they should be modified and changed as time goes on. The last problem, and this is the last section of part one of my presentation, is just general complexity. Ecological systems are already notoriously complex. They any scientist who says they have complete knowledge of how ecosystems work is not being truthful. They're very complex. We can only guess at how they work. We can make pretty good guesses about how they work, and we can observe tendencies and trends in them and make decisions based on that. But no one has complete knowledge of an ecosystem. It's beyond human understanding. So that's already complex. Now you take that complexity and you put it into an urban area, which has a similar level of complexity. You know, human politics and development on an estuary just makes everything really hard And that's something that needs to be figured out and ironed out as much as possible. And some of the ways you could do that is through environmental education and outreach. As I mentioned earlier, kind of like community ecological IQ, if you can use that term, just general knowledge and information about what we have, and kind of making the decision-making process a little smarter, and helping science and cultural knowledge, local knowledge really lead the decision-making process. Technical guidance, very important. All sorts of experts guidance out there that should really be relied on whenever possible. Peer-reviewed guidance is great when you have more than one expert in a room. You tend to get a better opinion, and a rigorous dialogue around what's best for the estuaries should really be encouraged. Last but not least is wayfinding and signage, which helps simplify the landscape for a lot of residents and visitors to the estuary. A great example of this is if you go to St. Mary's by the Sea, you have a consistent color for all the streetlights and style of streetlights. It's that kind of like marine style, and you really know, like, oh, I'm at St. Mary's right now when I see this. We're proposing something like that, maybe not that extreme, but throughout the entire estuary on the Fairfield and on the Bridgeport side, to really unify people and make them feel like they're part of one ecological system. The very simplest and probably too simple thing that many of you have seen, I'm sure, is emblems on stormwater drains that says this drain leads to Long Island Sound. You know, something like that, but more advanced, more maybe a particular type of bench or a theme that kind of transcends political borders and is based more on ecosystem identity. I think before we move on to the next section, it's important to consider a few key points here. One is this idea of co-benefits, talking about really large scale investments in things like street trees and landscapes and wetlands. That's not just a donation to the universe that humankind never sees again. That is actually a benefit to our communities. For example, when you plant a street tree, it's not just good for, say, migratory songbirds. It also decreases the air conditioning bills on those blocks by decreasing the summertime temperature. It has great psychological benefits. It's proven that people who live around trees suffer less from depression and anxiety, which are both epidemics right now in our world, kind of nature deficit disorder. They collect stormwater, and actually, when it first rains, a tree collects a lot of gallons of water on its leaves before it actually drops to the ground. The more water you can divert from the stormwater sewer system, the less problems you'll have with things like combined sewer overflows or stressing our infrastructure system. So that's just one example of a tree. Same thing goes for wetlands. Same thing goes for the barrier spit. A lot of human benefits come from investing in ecosystem restoration. Important to keep in mind. Second thing is the time is really now to to do a lot of these projects. And the reason is because the inflationary pressures, we're all tired of the word of inflation these days, but this is really true with ecological systems. You have in this graph we made, this dotted red line is like your average construction costs over time, which tend to go up just generally. We have time on the bottom and dollar amount on the y-axis. But with ecosystems, the cost of restoring rapidly degrading ecosystems really, really accelerates, goes up quickly, because things like storms come in and really tear things apart. And if something's already degrading, the worse it gets, the more expensive it is to fix. So what I mean by this is, like, now is really the time to address things like the eroding barrier spit or do the thin layer deposition on Great Marsh Island, because if those things were to go away or be very degraded, it would be much more expensive in the future to fix those. So now it's not going to get any cheaper to do this kind of work. You could also expect in the next 20 years, as the sea level rises really start to impact local decisions, more competition for funding. And well, the funding is there. If it's there, we should take advantage of it as soon as possible. In the future, it might not be there. Okay, so that's the the first section of the presentation, I'm just gonna pause here for a second to see if there's any comments. And then I'll start the share again, but it looks like we're good. And okay, so I'll start the next section here. So we broke up the estuary into these 5 areas in our study. Area A, we call the Upper Creek. It's up here, just north of the bridge, 136. The train station is right up here as well to orient yourselves. And then area B is the Lower Creek, which includes Great Marsh Island and a lot of Black Rock. Area C is the tidal inlet, which is the Barrier Spit and the navigable channel. Area D, Turney Creek, and area E, Riverside Creek. So what I'd like to do is go through each of these areas and talk briefly about some of the features in them that we should consider, and some of the impacts of sea level change that we might see. So here, 1934 versus 2019, area A, you can see the whole new train station is built. There's a big new residential development project going on right here. This is a low tide picture. You can see a lot of beautiful mudflat, which is a very productive carbon fixing type of habitat. There's also a more active proposal now. It seems like it will be real. The Fox, is it the Fox Street or Fox Avenue walkway, which is going to cross this section of the creek, provide pedestrian access, and really change things up here, I think, for the better in terms of recreational opportunity. I'd like to highlight also this small area where my clicker is poking. This is a created wetland. If you look back, that wetland was not there in 1934. It's a created wetland that collects upland stormwater, and you can park over here and walk through a boardwalk system that connects you to the trail system and see it in person. Some of you, I'm sure, have. But this is an example of how we can actually create wetland in areas where it had not existed before, and might be an opportunity for some Spartina marsh migration to move back into this more freshwater, less salty system. Focusing on this area, area A, what we've done is we've taken sea level rise predictions, low, intermediate, and extreme, and projected them into Google Street View imagery. So the red would be high tide on Canfield in 2100. The orange would be a more intermediate prediction, and then a more extreme prediction of sea level change would be a 6-foot rise. You would see high tide all the way up to here, which would probably destroy this building and all these buildings, residences to the left. Quite serious when you look at how this is actually going to impact the community. Down here on Kenmore, I have the same thing in the distance. This is a street end, and the estuary is kind of down at the end, and high tide is, we're looking about here, high tide is just going to come to the edge of the existing wetlands and bury those. But then in the low scenario, in the intermediate scenario, it's coming up a little higher. And then in the more extreme scenario, and 6 feet is extreme. There's more extreme predictions than a 6-foot rise, but it is on the higher end. You see it coming up, much further and really taking out this whole neighborhood. If you look over here, all this yellow would be buried at high tide. These drawings are rough drawings. You would need to go out with a professional surveyor to find the exact elevations. These are our approximations. So I'd like to point that out, that these are not the most refined predictions, but they are relatively accurate. And for the purposes of highlighting the potential impacts of sea level change, I think they're very good. That's area A. So one opportunity in area A is for a lot of living shoreline. if we go back to the aerial photo here, all these edges here where the Spartina is getting pinched are almost gone. There's an opportunity for living shoreline. Now, this living shoreline comes at a lot of scales. This is a really big scale, not what I'm suggesting, but it is good to show how a living shoreline works. It's out in Humboldt County, a proposal in California. On the left would be existing, on the right would be proposed. You see a rock edge built to break up the waves. And on the inland, actually, they add silt and mud and sand and plant Spartina marsh within that, right? That's a very large system to protect something like a highway. And what this does is it buffers storms and creates habitat. Great, but a little out of scale. I think, you know, for the Ash Creek estuary, something like this, this is down in Maryland, and this is protected by oyster reef out here. Something like this is more appropriate, like this kind of soft naturalistic texture that fits right into estuary, into the estuary. So now we have study area B here into the lower creek. Study area B in the lower creek, which is, you know, Black Rock is over here on the right, and then you have South Benson Marina on the left, and nestled within Fairfield. Up here is Turney Creek, the inlet of Turney Creek, and then this is system is Riverside Creek down here. A lot of change in this area since 1934. All this wetland has been lost. And a lot of this more robust wetland up in these areas has been overtaken by mudflat and erosion. Also, look at the absence of housing in Black Rock at this point. No houses were in these areas. These were open spaces. Very, very interesting. So now looking at some of the streets here, on the first image is Beachview Avenue. You can see here's a street end. In a conservative estimate, the high tide is coming right up to the edge of the street. And then the medium it's coming into the street and into the backyard of this house here. But then in the more extreme scenario, it's completely taking this house. So this is interesting because it is a prominent point. As these areas go underwater, like the Spartina wetland that's out at this point where my mouse clicker is, you'll have increased wave action and increased erosion happening at the same time. Be a very different kind of system with larger waves. Down here is Gilman. And Gilman, you can see pretty much right up to the edge of the street to the sidewalk is going to be high tide. And then in a medium scenario, that's a conservative, in a medium scenario, it's basically covering Gilman. And really, we should consider what to do with Gilman in the next 100 years. That's one of the challenges of sea level rise, is it kind of transcends generations. It goes beyond generations. We have enough trouble thinking about 4-year political cycles, much less thinking 100 or 200 years in advance. But at the same time, we should recognize that, it's a brief soapbox comment here, we should recognize that we are built on the efforts of people 100, 200, 500 years ago today, and have a lot of credit to give them for the lifestyle we have. So it's definitely a noble challenge to try to imagine how we can help not just our grandchildren, but our great-grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. So what does Gilman look like in 2100? That's a good question. And then in a more extreme scenario, you see it actually coming up into the front yards of people's houses, in some cases into their houses. It comes really far up into Black Rock over in this area here in the more extreme scenario. Fairfield has it a lot worse over here behind Jennings Beach, and we'll get into that in a second, but you can see this entire area is under threat. Now, one thing we proposed in this area is marsh accretion. So here's an idea of what that would actually look like, actually raising the level of the marshes. Essentially, you bring these giant marshland dredging machines through that blow into the air sediment that lands and basically creates an area that looks like it's been covered in mud, like recently flooded. And it looks like this for a few months, but then the grasses grow up through it robustly. It's kind of like if anyone's ever seen a prairie fire before, how black and dark the meadows are immediately after the fire, but just a few months later, they're lush and green. So this is what it looks like afterwards. I thought this would be helpful in case this project does actually happen in the estuary in the near term. You have some idea of what it might look like. Study area C, the tidal inlet. We talked about that a lot tonight. And here's the sea level rise predictions for that area. Now, this is a bit of a myth or misrepresentation because the barrier spit being all sandy is a very fluvial system, a very temporary system. So the shape of the landform would change as the tide rises. In reality, if you had a high tide at this moderate level, the orange line, the barrier spit would probably look very different as a consequence. But assuming it's a static system, you know, we're coming well high here at high tide and the most conservative, and then in the most extreme, the entire barrier spit is underwater. Now, this is assuming this is not accounting for the erosion that's currently happening, right? So what we're dealing on the barrier spit is a double-edged sword of beach erosion at the same time as seas are rising. So it's a very tough system to figure out. Dune restoration, I just want to point out a really positive, occurrence. This is a drone photograph I took last year before the beach restoration happened, and look how barren it was and how empty it was of granted this was winter, but still, like, not a lot of plants in here. I would say maybe 50% vegetative cover. Now today it looks like this. Dramatic change. This is really a great success. Study area C, it's not all just success here. If we look here in this area, this is not a naturally forming edge. This is a direct result of this dredging that's been occurring. Very harsh, and I think needs to be kept in mind and coordinated with. And I should point out that there has been a lot of progress in the past couple of years on this topic in both municipalities, and seem very committed to addressing it moving forward. But it is something that we need to pay attention to and make sure doesn't make the situation even worse than it is in the future. Turney Creek here, which I mentioned earlier, has seen quite a lot of development in its watershed, especially this section that's been completely buried now. It used to be open. Really big change. All these houses that have been popped up in here in the last 90 years, you see, they weren't there in 1934. There was not a lot of density behind Jennings Beach until the 1950s, after World War II. And in this area, you're really seeing very high levels of sea level rise, a lot of impacts of sea level rise. Here on Shoreham, you have, and in the most extreme scenario, this yellow line on this tree, this whole tree would be underwater at high tide, and none of these trees here will live at a high tide, or even close to a high tide situation. So you're seeing like complete loss of the vegetation, and total loss of these homes just on a daily basis. So a lot to be concerned about in the Turney Creek watershed. We talked about this slide earlier, but reconsidering how how possibly the Spartina Marsh could move upstream as the high tide lifts. And there could be some created in a daylit area here, again, between McDonald's and the Circle Diner. Could be a restored wetland right here. That would be pretty interesting to be in the parking lot in front of the Circle Diner, looking across and seeing a stream as opposed to this kind of intersection. It's a highlight of what's around there today, kind of from the side of the Stop and Shop parking lot, down to the bridge at the old Post Road and 130 here could be just revealed, possibly with a system of bridges that would allow for cars to continue to travel there. Riverside Creek, just huge amount of development on the backside of Jennings Beach here, which did not exist before. And this is our most advanced, most problematic area for sea level rise. Just all these houses, this whole community in here, really under threat from rising tides. This is from the parking lot behind the marina. Just completely changes things. I did my graduate thesis a long time ago, at the Rhode Island School of Design on coastal change in Southern Rhode Island. And this is a rendering I made on the left. Who was working with a community there called Roy Carpenter's Beach, and they were suffering rapid beach erosion. And I showed him this picture on the bottom. I'm like, well, this could be the future. You might have to give up a lot of land here to allow nature to take its course. And I'm not suggesting that necessarily abandonment of land, but buildings on stilts is something to consider, and definitely a more rigorous process of building review before new buildings are installed and new projects happen, to make sure that they account for this level of sea level change. Almost done with the presentation, and if you can handle a little bit more news about the sea level change, what we've been looking at so far is just simply high tide. Now we have to ask ourselves, what would happen if we had another Sandy level 9-foot storm surge event? And these are those same levels of prediction, low, medium, and high, considering a 9-foot storm surge. And you're looking, even in the most moderate sea level rise prediction, just massive flooding from a major hurricane with a major storm surge, just tons. And then medium, a lot. I mean, Black Rock essentially becomes an island in a medium surge. And then in the higher scenarios, just total coverage, just like everything. Basically, Black Rock actually is looking pretty good over here, the higher ground. But this is some serious news. So you could go back through all those previous predictions. For example, here on Turney Road, the yellow line would be approximately where the Sandy high tide surge would be, for a moderate situation. For a low situation, just like jump up 2 levels. Really serious stuff. And we are expecting more extreme storm surges and more frequent storm surges in the future as a result of warming seas. So in terms of implementation, and we're near the end of my presentation here, thank you for your patience so far. We need to be looking generally at government funding and assistance, grant applications, coordinations with municipalities, the co-management authority we're discussing, local laws and zoning, enforcements and initiatives. But then on the community level, continuing to do the types of things that ACCA does, volunteer plantings, cleanups, supplemental funding for pilot projects, education, those types of things. And then down to individual actions. Each of us, though it might seem small, can have our own impacts, home landscape improvements to address the habitat fragmentation. Voting, obviously, is very important locally and nationally. Volunteering, donating money, and generally participating in the process of creating a more resilient community. So here's our online presentation. Next move for us is to revise and complete our draft report and then the implementation of it.